Hello, and welcome to this week's musical devotion. Because my last few devotions have had varying degrees of what we might call homiletical excess, this week, I thought what I would do is share with you a Bach cantata and just discuss the music, particularly as it relates to the theology, and let it speak for itself. If you click the link below, you can see a performance by the Netherlands Bach Society, sung in a beautiful church with a fabulous acoustic. This is a fantastic way to hear this cantata. Bach's cantatas are like sermons in sound. He is often referred to as the fifth evangelist because of the extraordinary eloquence and Leviathan spiritual depth of his music. To our 21st century ears, sometimes the theology can be a little strained, owing particularly to the poetic and exegetical conventions of his time. But of the many miraculous things that Bach does as a composer, redeeming a clunky or a dark text surely must figure high. If one of his librettists was going to go to dark, rueful, or mournful places, Bach would often write music that would act as a balm. Even as difficult truths were being shared, even in lament, there is spectacular grace and beauty. Now that's not an issue for this cantata. I think the libretto is very lovely. And I'm going to share you this work that was written in 1724 as part of the first cycle of cantatas that Bach wrote in his new position as the Cantor at the St. Thomas Church in Leipzig. It had its first performance exactly 297 years ago today, January 6th, on the Feast of the Epiphany. In this cantata, which has the somewhat not evocative title of "They Will All Come Forth Out of Sheba," Bach is working to provide a sound picture of the gospel of the day, Mark's recounting of the arrival of the Magi, but using a text from the prophet Isaiah, which sort of foretells all of this. If you're following along, it's the 6th verse of the 60th chapter. I've linked below to a wonderful translation by Pamela Dalal for Emmanuel Music in Boston. It's an organization that's centered at Emmanuel Episcopal Church, where they offer a different Bach cantata every Sunday. Now, when you watch the video, you'll see a few interesting things. The Netherlands Bach Society performs with period instruments, so that all of the instruments of the orchestra were either built around the time of Bach's life, or they're copies of those instruments. The stringed instruments use gut strings instead of metal, and they play with shorter bows. For this work, in place of flutes, you'll see recorders, which are played at a much higher level than you're usually accustomed to hearing them. You'll see natural or valveless horns, fiercely difficult to play. And then you'll see the fascinating curved oboes da caccia, which in Italian means hunting oboes. They're pitched lower than a modern orchestral oboe, and they have a more rustic, almost husky sound. By using these instruments, Bach was seeking to lend the music a whiff of the exotic, and those da caccias sound to my ears a little amorphously Middle Eastern, as befits a work that is centered around the Epiphany. The opening chorus is a very regal affair. It begins with the horns intoning a noble fanfare in the meter of 12/8, so that each bar of music is divided into 4 groups of 3, and this gives the music a very lilting quality. It sounds something like this. And then the horns continue to sort of dialogue with the orchestra, and there are all these little sequences of interesting musical development. And then the orchestra all comes right before the singers come in. The orchestra plays this theme in unison. One of my friends likes to observe that this feels very much the way Bach probably would have imagined a camel ride. And it always cracks Amy up when I demonstrate. Da 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 da. There is that lilting 12/8 quality, which I think is very camel-esque, and that is not something that you often hear as a descriptor for Bach's music. So after the opening chorus, or in this opening chorus rather, there's this sense of procession and journey that is quite deliberate. After the initial choral entrances stack up on top of one another, Bach begins an elaborate fugue, which is something like a very complex round. And the music sounds like this. The basses sing this figure first. So this passage, which is really, really interesting, what Bach does is he stretches out the word kommen or come into what we would call a melisma. And what happens is the melisma kind of gives us that sense of lots of people coming from lots of places. Sie werden aus Saba alle kommen. Now, if I was in a slightly better state today, it's been a long day in the office, I would have tried to sing that in one breath, but I could tell that was not going to happen. But anyway, we have that sense, and then other entrances come in. The tenors come in a little bit higher. And each voice part, in turn, takes a turn singing this at a different pitch. And then it all comes together to create this very dynamic and active texture. It's kind of like seeing one of those watches that has the glass back and you can see all of the gears and all of the random parts working in synchronicity. It's really fabulous. It's beautifully written. It's one of my favorite Bach movements and one of my favorite Bach fugues. After that comes a chorale or a verse of a hymn. And I have to confess, I find the conductor's choices for the interpretation of this particular movement a little precious. But this is the great German Christmas chorale, Puer Nobis in Bethlehem, which would have been as familiar to the German Lutheran congregations of Bach's time as Joy to the World is to ours. And so it's this beautiful chorale. It's an opportunity for the congregation to hear music with which they are very familiar, as opposed to Bach's crazy evocation of the Middle East. After the chorale, we have the first recitative. Now, that is a real tongue twister of a word, recitative. Say that 5 times really fast. Often in the music of Bach's time and later in operas, recitative is used to declaim big chunks of text. In the case of the recit here, and it's easier to call them recits because it's so easy to fumble that word, the librettist or poet sort of recaps the narrative of the gospel, and then in the second half turns the recitative into a more personal reflection. This is where Bach and his poet librettist begin to preach in the form of a prayer. My Jesus, when I think about my duty now, I must also turn to your manger and likewise be thankful. For this day is a day of joy for me, since you, O Prince of Life, have become a light to the heathens and to their Savior. But what could I present you, heaven's King? If my heart is not too insignificant for you, then accept it graciously, since I can offer nothing more noble. Now, after the recitative, the same soloist, a baritone, sings this beautiful aria accompanied by those hunting oboes again. And this time the Middle East is imagined by Bach, which is sort of interesting because he never traveled more than 200 miles from his home region in Germany. And so we hear those oboes da caccia and the hunting oboes, which sound to me a little bit like a Middle Eastern wind instrument. The text in German is much more direct and powerful than the translation. The translation is, gold from Ophir is too meager. Now, in German, there is no mincing of words. Gold aus Ophir ist zu schlecht. Schlecht in German means bad. Now, Ophir is a city of indeterminate location. Some scholars think it might have been in India, but it is mentioned in the Bible as a center of great wealth. King Solomon received a cargo from Ophir every 3 years, which consisted of gold, silver, sandalwood, pearls, ivory, curiously, apes, and peacocks. Now, in this baritone solo, there's almost a pomposity about it, a rejection. The gold of Ophir is too bad compared to the gift of the believer's heart. It is a delightful and colorful aria. Then we hear another recit, this time from the tenor. Instead of propelling the narrative forward, the librettist develops the ideas of what the believer can return to God. The text, my heart that I bring to you in humility, it contains such things within itself that are the fruits of your spirit, the gold of faith, the incense of prayer, the myrrh of patience are my gifts. I think that's a beautiful sentiment. And it's rendered in this kind of recitative style. So it's sung rather quickly. There's very spare accompaniment. Sometimes it's just a cello, a small organ, a continuo organ, and sometimes a harpsichord as well. And then comes a really beautiful aria for the tenor. And it's another regal fare. It's in 3, so it still has that sort of lilting, noble quality to it. But if it were in one of the secular operas of Bach's time, this would seem like a love aria. The text is quite intimate and personal. Take me to yourself as your own. Take my heart as a present. All that I am, what I do and think, shall alone, my Savior, be dedicated to your service. Now the music has this beautiful lilting quality, as I said. So there's just this flowing and lovely sense of things. And then Bach does something very interesting because he can't help it. It's somewhat like the alla Colman melisma that happened before, those many notes of music to one syllable of text. And in this one, what he does is he stretches out the word alles, all that I am. And it's actually, I had to practice this a little bit because it's a really tricky little melisma. And so we hear the tenor sing this. And then it goes on. Oops, I flubbed that note. I should have practiced a little longer. And I'm glad I'm not saying this for you. It's kind of high in the tenor's voice, and there has to be this extraordinary dexterity to it. But what Bach is doing is he's showing the word all in this maximalist sort of musical way, and I just adore this passage. It's always fascinating to hear tenors take this on. And I want you to, when you listen to the cantata below, listen to how effortlessly Daniel Johansen, the tenor, makes this passage sound. The work then concludes with another chorale, which was beautifully harmonized by Bach. It's a lovely, if slightly understated bow on this beautiful honey of a cantata. The text wraps it all up. Well now, my God, so I settle comforted in your hands. Take me and make it so for me until my final end as you best know, so that my spirit is developed through its purpose, and your honor more and more shall exalt itself. I really hope that you'll listen to this work. It's 16 minutes and change. 16 minutes in change. I probably just made you decide not to do it. But in any case, it's only 16 minutes in change, and I hope that it will delight you in some measure as it does me, and that you'll be safe and that you'll be well in the coming week. God bless.